Have you ever had a nightmare so vivid that you couldn't tell if you were asleep or awake? Or heard a true story so unsettling that it left you questioning reality? Tonight, we dive into two chilling tales. One, a terrifying sleepover that turns into a waking horror. And the other, the real-life mystery of Maura Murray's disappearance, a case that still haunts investigators to this day. But before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, turn off the lights, sit back, and prepare yourself for the unknown. Story 1, The Nightmare in a Friend's House. I never thought much about my best friend's house. It was just another place I had spent countless nights eating junk food, watching movies, and talking about nothing until we passed out. It wasn't particularly old or creepy, just a regular suburban home with a slightly outdated interior and a weirdly quiet atmosphere at night. Her mom worked night shifts, so most of the time it was just the two of us. That night, we had been scrolling through our phones, half watching some random horror movie playing in the background. Nothing unusual, but at some point, exhaustion hit me out of nowhere, like my body just shut down before I could even register it. I wasn't lying down properly. My legs were twisted, my neck bent at an awkward angle on the armrest of the couch. I remember trying to move, but it was like my limbs weren't listening. That's when the dreams started. It didn't feel like a dream, though. I was still in her house, sitting exactly where I had been. The room looked the same, but something was off. The air felt heavier, thicker, like I was breathing in water. Then, I noticed the tablet on the coffee table, one I had never seen before. The screen flickered on by itself, showing what looked like security camera footage. Only the angles were strange, like the cameras had been hidden inside vents, inside walls. The images weren't of us. It was another family, sitting in the same living room. But their faces, God, their faces. Their features were warped, stretched unnaturally, their eyes sunken, mouths twitching like they were trying to speak but couldn't. And then I saw the maggots crawling out of their mouths, their nostrils writhing in their hair. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My fingers dug into the couch, but I couldn't feel the fabric. It was like I wasn't even there anymore, just watching, trapped in this nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The screen flickered, distorting for a second before shifting angles. More hidden cameras, a hallway, a kitchen, a bedroom. Each one showed the same twisted family, unmoving, as if they were aware of being watched but refusing to acknowledge it. My stomach turned when the footage jumped again, this time to a dimly lit basement. I didn't even know my friend's house had a basement. The camera focused on an old, rotting wooden door, and beyond it, something moved in the shadows. I couldn't make out what it was, just the shape of something hunched, breathing, waiting. Then, the screen cut to static. My body tensed. I wasn't just watching anymore. I could hear it. A low, wet breathing sound coming from somewhere inside the house, echoing like it was crawling through the walls. And then, the lights went out. In the footage, in the room, in the entire house. The darkness swallowed everything, thick and absolute. My ears rang with silence. For a moment, I thought maybe I had finally woken up. But then, the breathing sound started again, closer this time. A slow, dragging inhale, like something was sniffing the air. My whole body locked up with fear. I knew I had to move, had to wake up. But the second I tried, something shifted in the darkness. Not a sound, not a shadow, just the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was right there, right next to me. I tried to scream, to thrash, to do anything, but my body was frozen, useless. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something foul, like rotting meat. The breathing grew louder, more erratic, and just as I felt something graze against my arm, I woke up. Except, for a second, I wasn't sure I had. The room was dark, too dark. The only light came from my friend's phone screen, casting a faint glow on her face as she mindlessly scrolled. My heart was racing so hard I could barely think straight. My body still felt stiff, like I hadn't fully shaken off the nightmare. I sat up too fast, my head spinning, my skin clammy with sweat. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. It clung to the air like humidity before a storm, heavy and suffocating. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Nothing, but I knew, deep in my gut, that something wasn't right. "I need you to turn on the light," I said, my voice coming out hoarse, barely above a whisper. My friend barely looked up from her phone. "Dude, relax. You were just sleeping." Her voice was normal, completely oblivious to the sheer terror buzzing through my body. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. I needed the light on. Now please, just turn it on. Something in my voice must have caught her attention, because she sighed and pushed herself up, walking toward the switch. My stomach twisted as she reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the switch, the bulb flickered. Once, twice, then complete darkness. Just like in my nightmare. I felt the blood drain from my face. My breath caught in my throat, and then somewhere in the pitch black room I heard it. The breathing was faint at first, just a whisper of air moving in the darkness. But as my ears adjusted, I realized it wasn't coming from me. It wasn't my friend either. She was completely still, frozen by the sudden blackout. No, this breathing was different. It was slow, deliberate, like something savoring the moment. My stomach twisted with nausea as I recognized the sound. It was the same deep, wet breathing from my nightmare. The exact same. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My mind was racing, trying to come up with any logical explanation, but there wasn't one. My friend cursed under her breath, fumbling around for her phone flashlight. The screen's glow barely cutting through the darkness. What the hell, why? Did it go out like that? Her voice was shaky now. She heard it too. I could tell, but she didn't want to admit it. Then, just as her phone light flickered on, something shifted near the closet. A soft creak, like a floorboard, gently giving under weight. I sucked in a breath, my entire body stiff with fear. There was something in the room with us. The light from her phone wavered as she turned toward the sound. My stomach was in knots, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was too scared to even breathe. The closet door was closed, just as it had been when we first came into the room. But now, standing there in the dim glow, I could swear it looked different, like it wasn't fully shut anymore. A tiny sliver of darkness peeked through the gap between the door and the frame. Had it always been like that? My skin crawled as a new realization hit. I didn't remember hearing it open. My friend let out a nervous laugh, the kind you force when you're trying to convince yourself there's nothing to be afraid of. It's just an old house, she muttered, but her voice wasn't steady anymore. She was scared too. Slowly, she took a step forward, reaching for the closet handle. "Don't," I whispered, but she ignored me, her fingers wrapping around the knob. The second she touched it, the phone light flickered again just for a split second, but in that moment of darkness, I saw it. A shape, a figure, standing right behind her. I choked on a scream, and just as the light stabilized, the closet door yanked open on its own. My friend jumped back with a yelp, nearly dropping her phone. The closet door swung open completely, revealing nothing, just a dark, empty space. My chest heaved as I tried to process what I had just seen. I knew there had been something there. I saw it, even if only for a fraction of a second. My friend turned to me, her face pale. "Did you?" she started, but she didn't finish. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud. Then, the smell hit us. It was rancid, thick, like something rotten had been left to decay for weeks. It poured out of the closet, heavy and suffocating. I gagged, covering my nose. My friend did the same. "What the hell is that?" she choked out, stepping back. The air felt heavier, pressing down on us like we were sinking into it. And then, beneath the stench, I noticed something else, something even worse. A faint buzzing sound. My stomach lurched as I realized what it was. Flies. Somewhere, just beyond the reach of her flashlight, something was crawling with flies. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were filled with cement. My friend took another step back, her breathing ragged. The buzzing grew louder, filling the silence between us. My mind flashed back to my nightmare, the footage on that strange tablet, the maggots writhing in the faces of that unknown family. My skin broke out in a cold sweat. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Then, something moved inside the closet. A slow, deliberate shift, like weight being dragged across the wooden floor. My friend let out a strangled gasp and bolted for the door, yanking it open so hard it slammed against the wall. I didn't need any more, convincing I was right behind her. We tore through the hallway, past the darkened living room, past the kitchen, running like something was breathing down our necks. Just as we reached the front door, the lights flickered back on, every single one of them. The house stood silent, still, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. We stood there, panting, staring at each other like we were both waiting for the other to say something that would make this all make sense. But there were no words, no logical explanation. My friend's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, twisting it so fast that it nearly slipped from her grip. The door swung open, and the cool night air hit my face like a slap, shocking me back to reality. Without hesitation, we ran straight to her car. She fumbled with her keys, dropping them onto the pavement. "Hurry up," I hissed, looking back at the house, half expecting to see something staring at us from the window. But the windows were empty, too empty, like the house itself was watching us. She finally got the door open, and we both jumped in, locking the doors, as if that could somehow keep it whatever it was away from us. She started the car, tires screeching as we sped down the street. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We just had to get away. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound being the hum of the engine and our shaky breathing. My heart was still hammering in my chest, and I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the back seat. The neighborhood streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, and every flickering bulb made me flinch. Finally, my friend broke the silence. "I don't want to go back there." Her voice was barely above a whisper, like saying it any louder would make it real. I swallowed hard, gripping the fabric of my hoodie like a lifeline. "Me neither," I admitted. "At least, not tonight." We needed time to process, to convince ourselves we weren't losing our minds. So we did the only thing that felt safe. We drove straight to Walmart, a stupid, mundane place. But at that moment, it was the only place that felt normal. Bright lights, people, noise things that didn't belong to whatever horror we had just escaped from. Walmart was nearly empty when we got there, just a handful of late-night shoppers minding their own business. The bright fluorescent lights made everything feel surreal, like we had stepped into another world, one where the nightmare hadn't happened. We walked in without saying a word, grabbed an energy drink each, and sat in the little seating area near the registers. Neither of us touched our drinks. I kept my hands wrapped around the can, feeling its coldness against my palms, grounding me, do you think? I started, but I didn't know how to finish. My friend stared at the floor, eyes unfocused. "I don't know," she muttered. "I don't know what I think." We sat there for what felt like forever, replaying everything in our heads, trying to rationalize it. But the more I thought about it, the worse it got. The nightmare, the lights, the buzzing, the closet, none of it made sense. And worst of all, it felt unfinished, like we had left something behind. After about an hour of sitting there, pretending to scroll through our phones, my friend finally sighed. "We can't just stay here all night." She was right, but the idea of going back to her house made my stomach twist. "What if we just crash at my place?" I suggested, but she shook her head. "My mom would freak if she woke up and I wasn't home." Reluctantly, we got back in the car. The drive felt slower this time, like the air itself was heavier. My friend barely spoke, just gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The closer we got to her house, the more wrong everything felt. It wasn't just fear, it was dread. The street looked the same as before, but something in my gut told me we shouldn't be here. As we pulled into the driveway, I hesitated before getting out. The house was dark again, every single light off, but we had left them on. We just sat there for a moment, staring at the house. My friend had locked the front door when we left. I saw her do it, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been inside while we were gone. The air in the car felt suffocating, thick with unspoken fear. "I don't want to go in," I whispered. She exhaled sharply, gripping the keys so hard they jingled. "Me neither," she admitted. "But we couldn't just sit outside all night." With a deep breath, she forced the door open, and I followed, every nerve in my body on high alert. The moment we stepped inside, the silence was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was heavy, pressing down on us, like the house itself was holding its breath. My friend reached for the light switch. It flickered for a second, then nothing. Pitch black. A cold wave of panic shot through me. I grabbed my friend's arm, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Nope, this isn't normal." My voice barely sounded like mine. She tried the switch again, flicking it up and down frantically. Nothing, just like before. Then, from deeper inside the house, a noise, a soft, shuffling sound, like bare feet dragging against the floor. My entire body locked up. My friend went rigid beside me. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I could barely nod. We weren't alone. Something was in here with us. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my legs barely holding me up. The noise shuffling like something dragging across the floor got louder, closer. It was coming from the hallway, just past the darkened living room. My friend's hand trembled in mine as she slowly started to move toward the source of the noise. I wanted to scream, to tell her to stop, but I couldn't make a sound. It was like the air had thickened around us, choking any words from escaping. The hallway was pitch black, but the dim outline of a door at the far end stood there, almost taunting us. Without thinking, my friend crept forward, her footsteps barely making a sound, but every step felt like a thunderclap in my mind. I followed, feeling like I was sinking deeper into the dread, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. We reached the door, and just as she was about to grab the handle, the shuffling stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something else to move. My friend hesitated, her fingers just inches away from the handle, before pulling her hand back. What if we just leave? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I could hear the fear in it, and I wanted to agree. But there was something in me, some part of my mind, that kept pulling me forward. I couldn't explain why, but I needed to know what was in that room. We both stood there for a long moment, frozen, before she took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, its sound sharp and unnatural in the stillness of the house. My heart was in my throat as we stepped into the dark room. The air was thick, like it had been trapped there for years. It smelled musty, stale, like something hadn't been touched in ages. The room was eerily empty, save for a single, old chair in the middle of the floor. It looked out of place, old, worn, and oddly out of place, like it had been there far longer than anything else in the house. The darkness in the room felt suffocating, almost as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching us. My friend took a shaky step forward, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the chair as if it held the answers we needed. Then I saw it just for a split second, a shadow moving behind the chair. It was quick, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Something or someone was in the room with us. I opened my mouth to say something, but my voice caught in my throat. My friend didn't seem to notice. She took another step closer to the chair, and that's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound that wasn't quite a whisper, but it wasn't a noise I could explain either. My body went rigid, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her back. We need to go. Now, I hissed, but she wasn't listening. She was frozen, staring at the chair. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it more clearly. The chariot wasn't empty anymore. A figure was sitting in it. I could barely make out the shape in the dark, but the way it sat there, motionless, felt like it was staring right at us, even though its face was hidden in the shadows. I felt a cold, sickening wave of fear wash over me, as if something had just clicked into place. We weren't supposed to be here. I tugged on my friend's arm again, more forcefully this time. Let's go now! I practically screamed, but she didn't move. She wasn't even blinking. I was shaking, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. What was that thing in the chair? Why wasn't she reacting? Then the lights flickered again, and the figure in the chariot moved, a twisted, jerking motion, like it was trying to get up, but not quite able to. My heart was in my throat as I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on us. I was shaking uncontrollably now, my eyes glued to the figure as it slowly, deliberately turned its head toward us. I couldn't see its face, thank God, but I could feel it, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The darkness around it seemed to thicken, curling like smoke, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard faint whispers so low. I couldn't tell if they were coming from the thing in the chair or from somewhere deeper inside the house. The very air felt wrong. Then, as quickly as it had moved, the figure froze again, its head tilted, almost like it was studying us. My friend was still standing there, not blinking, not breathing. I had to get her out of there, but my body refused to move. I felt like I was paralyzed, trapped in some kind of nightmare where my mind knew what to do, but my body wouldn't listen. Finally, with what felt like every ounce of strength I had left, I grabbed her arm and yanked her out of the room. She didn't resist, but she didn't seem to be aware of what was going on either. We bolted down the hallway, almost tripping over our own feet as we ran toward the front door. The house was so quiet now, too quiet, but I could still feel the presence following us. We reached the front door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. My hand gripped the handle, twisting and yanking, but it was like the door had been sealed shut from the inside. Panic surged through me. What the hell? I screamed, pulling harder, but nothing. My friend was still standing there, staring blankly ahead, her face pale, her eyes unblinking. I wanted to slap her, shake her, do something, but I couldn't leave her behind. Behind us, I heard the shuffling sound again. It was close now, unmistakable, like it was right outside the door. My heart raced faster. The sound was coming from the hallway, but there was no one there. I whipped around, looking into the pitch-black living room, but it was empty. My eyes darted to every corner, my body frozen in place, waiting for something to emerge. I could feel the air crackling, thick with dread, but there was no time to waste. I turned back to the door and pushed with all my strength, not caring how hard it was to breathe. With one final push, the door creaked open. It wasn't much, but it was enough. We both rushed out into the cold night air, my lungs gasping for breath as I pulled her with me down the porch steps. But as I looked back toward the house, I swear I saw a figure standing in the window, its face still hidden, just watching us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline still coursing through me as we ran toward the street. My legs were shaky, and I was barely able to keep my balance, but I couldn't stop, not until we were far away from that house. I didn't dare look back again. Every instinct screamed at me to just get out, get as far from that place as possible. We didn't say a word as we rushed down the road, both of us breathless and frantic. The lights from the street lamps cast long shadows along the pavement, but they felt safer than the darkness we had just escaped. After what felt like hours, we finally stopped at the edge of a gas station. My friend still hadn't spoken, and I didn't know what to say. I was too shaken, too confused, to form any coherent thoughts. Did you see that? I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. She just kept looking at the ground, her hands clenched tightly into fists. I wanted to shake her, scream at her to snap out of it, but I could see she was just as rattled as I was. She hadn't seen the same things I had, hadn't felt the same terror, but somehow she knew something was wrong. We ended up driving to Walmart. It was the closest place we could think of to get away from that house, to put some space between us and the creeping horror we had just lived through. But the atmosphere didn't really change. We were physically removed from it, but the unease was still there, like a shadow that just wouldn't leave. When we finally walked into Walmart, the fluorescent lights above us seemed so harsh, so normal, that it almost felt like I had just woken up from a bad dream. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Every corner of that store felt too bright, too sterile, like I was waiting for something to jump out at me from the aisles. My mind kept replaying the images of the house, the figure in the chair, the whispers, the shadows that seemed to move on their own. It all felt too real to have been just a nightmare. I turned to look at my friend, hoping to find some kind of reassurance in her, but she was just standing there, staring at the shelves with empty eyes. She didn't seem to be with me, like she was somewhere else, trapped in the same nightmare, but in her own world. I walked up to her and shook her lightly. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond, but after a long moment, she blinked, as if finally snapping out of whatever trance she had been in. I just don't want to think about it," she muttered, her voice distant. "Let's just forget it happened." I nodded, though I knew neither of us would ever truly forget it. The image of that house, of the twisted figure in the chair, would stay with me forever. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whispers, feel the cold pressure of the darkness, as if it were following me, waiting for me to let my guard down. But as the hours passed, the reality of what happened began to sink in, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. We never should have left. We spent what felt like hours inside Walmart, but in reality, it was only a short time before my friend finally snapped out of her daze. We both tried to act normal, grabbing a few random items just to feel like we were doing something. But every time I turned my head, I felt the weight of it, that feeling that something was just waiting to creep back into our lives. When we finally decided to leave, I thought we'd be safe. I thought the worst was over, but deep down I knew it wasn't. On the drive back to her house, the familiar streetlights passed by like blurs. But the closer we got to her neighborhood, the heavier the air in the car became. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel, my throat tight. It was as if the house itself had followed us, and even though we hadn't gone back inside yet, I could still feel it like an invisible weight pressing down on me. My friend didn't say a word the whole ride. She kept her eyes glued to the window, lost in her thoughts, but I could see her hands trembling in her lap. When we pulled into the driveway, the house loomed in front of us. My heart seemed to stop for a second. The porch light flickered once, then twice, Just like in the dream, or was it a nightmare? I couldn't tell anymore. I felt like I was losing my mind. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. "We need to get inside," I whispered, more to myself than to her. But the moment we stepped out of the car, I froze. There was something about the house, now something different, something wrong. The closer we got to the door, the more my skin prickled. It wasn't just the cold night. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for us to enter. I reached for the door handle, but my hand shook so badly, I nearly missed it. When I finally managed to turn the knob, I felt an almost overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The house smelled different now, like dust and something old, like something that hadn't been touched in years. My legs felt weak as I stepped inside, and I glanced over at my friend. She hadn't said a word, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't want to be here either. We made our way to her bedroom, the silence between us thick, suffocating. As soon as I sat down on the bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It felt like something was standing just behind me, watching. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a shadow, but nothing was there. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces in my nightmare again, the disfigured family, their skin crawling with maggots. The memory made me gag, and I immediately opened my eyes again, staring at the dark corners of the room. My friend finally spoke, her voice hoarse, almost fearful. "Let's just sleep, okay? Just sleep and forget about all of it." Her words barely made sense to me anymore. I was too scared to even close my eyes, afraid I would see them again, the twisted faces, the cameras hidden around the house. But I didn't want to argue, didn't want to stay awake in that terrifying silence. So I lay back on the bed, hoping the exhaustion would take over. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I felt that same chill in the air. It was so cold that I could see my breath. I opened my eyes again, and the room was completely dark. No moonlight coming through the window, no light from the hallway, just darkness. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I reached for the light switch, but my hand trembled too much to make the connection. I wasn't sure if I was still in that nightmare, or if this was real. But the feeling of terror washed over me like a wave, and I felt like I was suffocating. I tried to sit up, but the weight of the darkness in the room pressed down on me, making me feel trapped. The room felt colder now, colder than I remembered, like the house had somehow sucked all the warmth out. I looked over at my friend, who was still sitting on the edge of the bed, but now she wasn't staring at her phone anymore. Her face was blank, almost expressionless. She wasn't even blinking, just staring straight ahead, like she was frozen. I shook her arm, but she didn't respond. It was as if she wasn't even in the room with me anymore. Panic started to set in. I needed to get out of there, but the door was locked. I hadn't locked it. I couldn't have. But when I stood up to go toward it, my legs wobbled like I was going to collapse any second. Every step I took felt like I was walking through thick, wet mud. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, and for a second, I thought I was going crazy. I looked at the ceiling, watching the bulbs flicker and hum. But then they cut out completely, just like before, in the nightmare. My heart skipped a beat. The room was plunged back into darkness, the kind of darkness that makes your ears ring and your pulse race. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to face whatever was behind me, but I couldn't stop myself. I slowly, painfully turned my head, and that's when I saw it. There, in the corner of the room, standing perfectly still, was the figure. It was shadowed, and I couldn't make out any real details, but I knew it was there. Watching me, I felt the bile rise in my throat as I took a step back, too terrified to even scream. My entire body froze in fear, and the silence in the room became unbearable. I felt like I was suffocating again. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the shadow in the corner, but it felt like an eternity. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My mind was telling me to look away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. I just kept staring at it, hoping it would vanish, hoping it wasn't real, but it didn't. It stayed there, unmoving, like it was waiting for something. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure seemed to shift. It didn't step forward or make any sound, but something about its outline. It changed. It grew larger, stretching out of the corner like it was becoming more solid. I swear I could hear something faint, like a soft dragging sound, but it was so quiet that it could have just been my imagination running wild. My breath hitched in my throat as the figure began to grow closer. I took a sharp step back, and suddenly, the light flickered back on. For a brief moment, the room was blindingly bright, the harsh light cutting through the shadows, revealing nothing. There was nothing in the corner, nothing at all. I blinked, and when I looked again, the corner was completely empty. I turned to my friend, still sitting motionless on the bed, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't understand what was going on. My mind was a whirlpool of confusion and fear. I didn't trust the light anymore. I didn't trust the house. I grabbed my phone and texted her. We need to get out now. It wasn't even a question anymore. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get away from whatever had been haunting that house. She didn't say anything. She didn't even move. I had no idea if she was hearing me, if she even knew where we were anymore. I turned around to head for the door, my body trembling from the inside out. The air in the room felt heavy again, and I could almost hear the walls groaning, like the house was alive. I grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked again. My stomach churned as I panicked. I pulled at the handle, yanked it, screamed silently in my mind. Then, just like before, I felt the air change. Something moved. The door opened on its own. I couldn't believe it. The door had just opened, as if it had been waiting for me to touch it. I didn't waste a second. I bolted for the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't care if my friend was still behind me or not. I just needed to get out. The house felt wrong. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should have, the sound filling my ears and making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I could still feel the weight of whatever had been in that room, following me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I ran down the stairs, not even bothering to check if she was following. The hallway felt even darker than before, like the light from the living room wasn't quite enough to push the darkness away. The air felt thick and cold, pressing against my skin, making it hard to breathe. I reached the front door, pulling at the handle frantically. It didn't open. It was locked. I tried again, pulling and yanking with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of footsteps behind me made my heart freeze. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see what was there. Instead, I slammed my shoulder into the door, trying to break it open. But before I could try again, I felt it something icy, cold, brushing against my neck. It felt like a hand. I snapped around. My breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty hallway stretching out into the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to leave. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking so badly that it almost fell out of my grasp. I called my mom. When she picked up, I could barely get the words out, but I managed to tell her I needed to be picked up, that something was wrong at the house. I could hear her voice on the other end, calm but confused. She asked if I was sure, if I had been drinking, if I was overreacting. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I stood there, waiting for my mom to arrive, staring at the door, hoping it would open. Every creak, every groan of the house felt like a threat, but nothing happened. The door remained locked, and all I could do was wait. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like an eternity. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. It was almost as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. My heart was racing, my thoughts scattered. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Finally, I heard the faint sound of an engine in the distance. Relief flooded through me as I realized my mom was here. But when I went to move toward the door, the house did something I can't explain. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps or creaking wood. It was like the house shifted, like it was alive, as if it was resisting me, trying to hold me there. I heard the door handle turn on its own. My breath caught in my chest. Slowly, I backed away from it, feeling an invisible weight on my shoulders, pushing me back into the darkness of the house. The light from the outside world that should have been comforting felt miles away, and I was trapped in this oppressive, cold atmosphere. I could hear my mom calling my name outside, but it sounded muffled, distorted, like she was miles away instead of just at the front door. I grabbed the handle again, panic setting in, and this time, I yanked it open, almost falling out onto the porch, and in the split second I was free. I looked back. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. The lights flickered on for a moment, casting long shadows against the walls, and for the briefest moment, I swear I saw a figure in one of the upstairs windows, someone or something watching. But just as quickly as I saw it, it was gone. I rushed to the car, feeling the safety of it, the warmth of the outside air, as my mom sped off toward Walmart, the only place I could think of to escape. My body was shaking uncontrollably. But I didn't want to tell my mom what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just needed to get as far away from that house as possible. Even now, I can't explain what happened. It doesn't make sense. I've never experienced anything like it before, and I haven't since. The house is still there, standing empty, but I know I'll never be able to go back not after what happened that night. There's something about that place, something dark that I can't put into words. I don't know if I was just imagining it all, or if something truly was there. But one thing is certain, I'll never forget that feeling. And I'll never, ever step foot inside that house again. Next story, the disappearance of Maura Murray. I first heard about Maura Murray's disappearance during my sophomore year at UMass Amherst. It was the kind of thing that started as a whisper missing student, an abandoned car, no answers. But soon, it was everywhere. The more I read about it, the more it burrowed into my brain. She had emailed her professors about a family emergency, taken money out of her bank account, and driven off, only to crash on a rural New Hampshire road. When the cops showed up, she was gone. No footprints in the snow, no calls home, just vanished. It didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was because she was a student like me, walking the same halls, breathing the same cold Massachusetts air. Maybe it was because the details were so off, so unfinished. I started going to discussions about it, reading every article I could find. But obsession does weird things to you. It makes you reckless. A few weeks later, I heard about the house. No one ever talked about it in the news, but some people swore it was connected to an abandoned place, not far from where Maura's car was found, the kind of house locals avoided. A friend of mine, Darren, said that when he and some buddies drove past it once, they saw a light flicker in the attic. Place has been empty for decades, he said, but sometimes people see movement inside. That was all it took. I had to go. Not for some ghost hunting thrill, not for fun. I just needed to know if there was anything that could explain what happened to her. So one freezing Saturday, just before dusk, I drove up to that stretch of desolate road, parked a little ways off, and made my way toward the house. The house was worse than I expected. I thought it would be some typical abandoned building, broken windows, graffiti, maybe a few beer cans left behind by teenagers. But this place felt wrong the second I saw it. The roof sagged like it was exhausted from holding itself up, and the windows weren't just broken, they were black, hollow, like something had sucked all the life out from inside. The front door was slightly open, not enough to swing, just enough to invite. I told myself the wind had done it, but there was no wind that night, just dead, heavy air. My breath came out in thick white clouds as I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under my weight, the kind of sound that makes you feel unwelcome. I hesitated, phone in one hand, flashlight in the other. This was stupid. But then I thought about Maura. If she had come here, if she had been brought here, maybe there was something inside that could explain why she disappeared. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and something else I couldn't quite place. Rot, maybe? The floor was uneven, and every step made the old boards creak loud enough to set my teeth on edge. I moved my light across the walls, peeling wallpaper, deep scratches near the baseboards, and an old staircase leading up into darkness. A cold prickle ran up my spine as I realized there were no signs of squatters. No trash, no beer bottles, no graffiti. Just emptiness, like the place had been abandoned all at once and left to rot. My stomach twisted as my flashlight landed on a single object in the middle of the room, a chair. Wooden, old, facing the staircase. Nothing else in the room. Just that damn chair, like it was waiting for someone. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was nothing. But then I heard it. A noise from upstairs. A slow, deliberate creak, like weight shifting on old wood. I froze. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't the house settling or some animal scurrying in the walls. It was a footstep, heavy, deliberate. My throat tightened as I aimed my flashlight up the stairs, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around and get the hell out, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. My boots felt too loud on the wooden floor, like I was announcing myself to whatever was up there. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, the air changed. It got colder, not just a little, but enough that I could see my breath, even though the rest of the house wasn't that cold. That's when I noticed something worse. The air smelled different. It wasn't the musty, rotten scent from before. It was something sharp, metallic, like blood. I swallowed hard and pointed my flashlight up the stairs. For a second, I thought I saw something move, just a shadow, quick and jerky, disappearing into the dark. My pulse slammed in my ears. I wasn't alone. The thought made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to keep going. I gripped the railing and started up, step by step, until I reached the top. The hallway stretched out in both directions, doors lining the walls, all of them slightly open. My stomach knotted at the sight. Open doors in an abandoned house meant one of two things: either someone had been through here recently, or something didn't want them closed. I hesitated, then turned left, stepping toward the first room. I pushed the door open wider and swept my light inside. The room was almost empty, except for one thing. On the far wall, written in what looked like smeared dirt or something worse, was a single word: help. My stomach dropped. The word looked rushed, uneven, as if someone had scraped it onto the wall with shaking hands. My flashlight trembled slightly as I moved the beam across the rest of the room. Nothing else, no furniture, no signs of life, just that desperate plea on the wall. I took a shaky breath and stepped back into the hallway, my ears straining for any sound. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from one of the rooms further down the hall. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, deliberate. Tap, tap, like someone drumming their fingers against wood doors signaling. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to move toward the sound, my footsteps barely making a noise now. The door at the very end of the hall was cracked open, just enough for darkness to spill out from inside. The tapping stopped the second I reached it. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open wider, my flashlight cutting through the thick black pit. The room was small, empty except for a single object in the corner, a closet with its doors slightly ajar. My breath hitched. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something inside. A shape, low to the ground, like someone crouching. My chest tightened, and I took an involuntary step back. The light flickered again, and this time, I saw it clearer: two pale fingers gripping the edge of the closet door, just barely visible in the dim beam of my flashlight. My throat clenched. Those fingers weren't moving. They weren't adjusting their grip or shifting. They were just there, like they were waiting. A rush of cold dread shot through me, and I did the only thing my body would allow. I turned and bolted. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care what was in that closet, just knew I had to get the hell out of that house. My boots pounded against the warped wooden floor as I sprinted down the hall, past the open doors, past the room with help smeared on the wall. My breath came in sharp gasps, and every part of me screamed to move faster. But just as I reached the top of the staircase, the house shifted. It wasn't an earthquake, not even a creak of old wood settling. It was something deeper, heavier, like the whole place had exhaled around me. The air turned dense, pressing against my skin, making it harder to move. I forced myself forward, grabbing the railing for balance as I stumbled down the first few steps until I heard it. Footsteps not mine, coming from the hallway behind me. They weren't fast. They weren't panicked like mine had been. They were slow, measured, following. I clenched my teeth, my pulse hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I knew, deep in my bones, that if I looked, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to, something that had been waiting. I hit the last few steps, practically throwing myself into the main room. The chair was still there, still facing the staircase, but now it wasn't empty. My flashlight flickered as it landed on the figure sitting in it. A woman, head tilted slightly, hands resting on her lap. No movement, no sound, but I knew she was looking at me, even though her face was hidden beneath a mess of dark, stringy hair. Even though she didn't move an inch, I felt her watching me. I couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, locked in place by something I didn't understand. The woman didn't move, didn't react, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt an unbearable weight pressing down on me, like I was sinking into the floor. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I saw more. Her hands weren't resting on her lap. They were clenched, fingers digging so hard into her skin that it looked like they might tear through. And her hair. It wasn't just messy, it was wet, dripping onto the floor beneath her. A sickening dread twisted in my stomach. Every instinct told me to look away, to bolt out the door. But before I could even take a step, she moved. It wasn't a normal movement. It was too sharp, too sudden-like. Her whole body jerked forward all at once, without any sign of effort. The sound that followed wasn't human. A choking, gasping gurgle, like something was forcing its way up her throat. My vision blurred as my body finally listened. I turned and ran. I hit the door hard, bursting out into the freezing night air, lungs burning, legs shaking. But just as I reached my car, just as I fumbled with my keys, something made me stop. A sound quiet, but close. I turned my head, just enough to see the house one last time. And there, in the upstairs window, barely visible through the dark, was a face. Not the woman, someone else, watching, unmoving. And then the light in the attic flickered on. I didn't wait to see more. I yanked my car door open, threw myself inside, and jammed the key into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, but as I looked up at the house one last time, my stomach twisted. The attic light was still on, a dim yellow glow spilling out from the highest window, silhouetting the shape standing there. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a figure, completely still, head slightly tilted, as if it was studying me. My breath hitched. The woman in the chair hadn't followed me. Whatever was in the attic had been waiting. I slammed the car into reverse, tires skidding against the dirt road as I spun around and sped off, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. My heart didn't slow until the house was completely out of sight, swallowed by the darkness of the trees. Even then, my skin crawled with the lingering feeling of being watched. I didn't stop until I was miles away, pulling into a gas station just to catch my breath. Hands trembling, I reached for my phone and opened my search history, staring at Maura Murray's name at the top of the list. My mind raced. Had she been there? Had she seen what I saw? Had she gone up to that attic and never come back down? I didn't know, and I don't think I ever will. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, parked under the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station. My pulse still hadn't settled. My hands were still ice cold. No matter how much I tried to shake it off, the image of that figure in the attic burned in my mind. It knew I was there. It watched me leave. And worst of all, it didn't try to stop me. That was what scared me the most. The woman in the chair had moved. She'd jerked forward like she was trying to reach me. But the thing in the attic had just stood there, like it had been expecting me. Like I had just played a part in something that was already set in motion. The thought made my stomach turn. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that my brain had twisted shadows into something sinister. But I couldn't ignore what I had felt in that house, the weight in the air, the shifting silence, the unbearable sense that I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be seen. I don't remember driving home. My body was on autopilot, running purely on adrenaline and fear. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at my darkened house. The idea of going inside made my skin crawl. The thought of walking into another empty building, of seeing another open door waiting for me couldn't do it. So I stayed in my car until the sun started to rise, until exhaustion finally won over fear. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me. The first few nights after that, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that attic window, that figure, that waiting presence. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that fear had a way of making you see things that weren't really there. But deep down, I didn't believe that, because the feeling hadn't gone away. It followed me home. At first, it was subtle little things I could explain away. My bedroom door would be slightly open in the morning when I knew I had closed it the night before. Objects would be in different places. My phone, my keys, a book I swore I left on the coffee table. Then came the noises. Soft shuffling in the hallway when I was in bed. A faint creak outside my bedroom door, like someone shifting their weight just beyond the threshold. The first time it happened, I told myself it was the house settling. By the third night, I wasn't so sure. Then, the dreams started. The dreams weren't like normal nightmares. They didn't have a story, a build-up, or even a real event. They were just places, the same places, over and over again. I'd be standing in the hallway of that house, staring down the stretch of open doors, feeling that same crushing weight in the air. Or I'd be at the bottom of the attic stairs, looking up into the darkness, knowing something was right there, just beyond where the light reached. I never saw it, but I felt it. Then, one night, the dream changed. I was back in my own bedroom, everything exactly as it should be, but something was wrong. The air felt too thick, too heavy, just like in the house. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body was frozen under the covers, but my eyes were wide open, locked onto my bedroom door. And then, it opened. Not fast, not violently, just a slow, creeping inch at a time until the darkness of the hallway bled into the room. I couldn't see anything beyond it, but I felt it standing there, watching, waiting. When I woke up, the door was open. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up in bed, back pressed against the headboard, staring at that open door like it was a wound in reality. I tried to tell myself I had forgotten to close it before going to sleep, that maybe a draft had pushed it open. But deep down, I knew better. That door had moved before I woke up, and something had been standing there. The next day, I avoided my bedroom as much as possible. I left every light on, kept the TV running for background noise, anything to make my apartment feel normal again. But the feeling never left, that constant, gnawing sensation of being watched. My skin prickled every time I passed a darkened doorway or caught my own reflection out of the corner of my eye. I started jumping at normal house sounds, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floor when I walked. I wasn't just scared anymore. I was unraveling. That night, I did something I hadn't done since I was a kid. Locked my bedroom door from the inside. I needed to know that if it opened again, it wouldn't be because of my own paranoia. I needed proof. I barely slept, but at some point, exhaustion must have won because I jolted awake to a sound. At first, I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of my bedside clock. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then I heard it again. A slow, dragging scrape against my bedroom door. Not a knock, not footsteps. Just a deliberate, steady pressure, like fingertips gliding along the wood. My stomach twisted into a knot. I turned my head toward the door, heart hammering so hard I thought I might be sick. The handle didn't move. The lock was still in place, but the sound kept going. A slow, methodical scraping, starting at the bottom of the door and rising higher. I wanted to call out, demand to know who was there, but my throat wouldn't work. My body wouldn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed, as the sound reached the height of the door handle. And then, in the unbearable silence that followed, something even worse happened. The handle jiggled. I stopped breathing. My entire body locked up as the handle twisted, just slightly, just enough to make a faint metallic click against the lock. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just lay there, staring, waiting for anything to happen. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. My ears rang with the absence of sound, my skin crawling as I strained to hear anything: footsteps, breathing, movement. But there was nothing, just a heavy, crushing stillness pressing down on me. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that, but eventually, the exhaustion took over again. My body couldn't handle the fear anymore, and at some point, I must have passed out. When I woke up, the room was bathed in pale morning light. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a dream until I sat up and saw the door. For long, dark scratches ran down the wood, starting near the handle and stretching all the way to the floor. I shot out of bed so fast I nearly tripped over myself. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door, hesitating just an inch away from the scratches. They weren't random. They weren't the kind of marks you'd expect from furniture scraping against the surface. They were deliberate for distinct lines, uneven but deep, like something had dragged its fingers down the wood. I unlocked the door with a trembling hand and yanked it open, half expecting to see something waiting for me on the other side. But the hallway was empty. The apartment was silent. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The front door was unlocked. I knew for a fact that I had locked it the night before. I knew. I had checked it at least 3 times, maybe more. And yet, there it was, open, just a crack, like someone had been standing there listening. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and walked straight out the door, not stopping until I was in my car, engine running, hands still trembling against the wheel. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there. I drove aimlessly for hours, barely aware of where I was going. I just needed distance from my apartment, from that door, from whatever the hell had been standing outside my room last night. My thoughts raced in circles, trying to make sense of it. Could someone have broken in? Was I losing my mind? I stopped at a diner on the outskirts of town, a place I had never been before, where no one would know me. I just needed to be somewhere normal, somewhere with people, noise, liked anything to shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I ordered coffee, but I barely touched it. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. At some point, I pulled out my phone, intending to call anyone, but I didn't even know what I would say. Instead, Almost on instinct, I opened my browser and searched Maura Murray haunted house. The results were the same as before: missing person theories, old articles, speculation. But as I scrolled, something caught my eye. A forum post buried deep in an old discussion thread. It was from years ago, written by some anonymous user. The title, "Do Not Go Into That House." My stomach dropped. I clicked on the post, my pulse hammering in my ears as the page loaded. The message was short, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. If you found this, it means you went there, or you're thinking about it. Either way, you need to listen. The house isn't empty. It never was. People talk about Maura like she just disappeared, but they don't understand. She's not gone. She's still there. And if you stay too long, if you pay too much attention, it notices you too. It follows you home. If things have started happening, leave now. Do not sleep there again. Do not be alone. It won't stop. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the words, my mind racing. This had to be a joke, right? Just some internet creep trying to scare people. But then I remembered the scratches on my door, the jiggling handle, the feeling that something had followed me. I scrolled down, searching for more, but the account was deleted. No replies, no context, just that single warning buried in an old thread. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I had ever truly left that house at all. I sat there, staring at my screen. The words burned into my brain. It follows you home. The diner around me suddenly felt too bright, too loud, like the real world was trying to drown out the creeping dread curling around my ribs. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining this. Someone else had been through it. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to think logically. Maybe this was just an elaborate internet hoax. Maybe I had let my obsession with Maura Murray's case get to me. But then I remembered the sound of my bedroom door handle jiggling, the deep scratches in the wood that hadn't been there before. The front door cracked open, even though I knew I had locked it. I had two choices: ignore this, pretend nothing was happening, go back to my apartment and try to convince myself I had imagined it all, or I could find out the truth. And against every ounce of self-preservation screaming at me to do otherwise, I got back in my car and I drove back to the house. The drive back felt different. Before, I had been curious, fascinated by the mystery of Maura Murray. Now, I was afraid, but I had to know. If I ran from this, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if it had all been in my head. If I was already marked, if it was already following me. What difference did it make? The house looked worse at night. The overgrown grass swayed in the cold wind, and the windows were just black voids, swallowing any light from the street. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every instinct told me to leave, but I killed the engine and stepped out. The air was thick, wrong, like walking into a place you weren't supposed to be. I forced myself forward, my footsteps crunching against dead leaves. When I reached the porch, the wood groaned under my weight. The door stood slightly ajar, like my apartment door that morning. My breath hitched. I stepped inside. The silence was suffocating. The air smelled stale, like rot and dust. But beneath it was something else, something damp, like breath. I swallowed hard and took another step forward, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The floorboards creaked beneath me, but something about the sound made my skin crawl. It echoed like there was space beneath the floor. And then I heard it, a whisper, not from the house, from behind me. Every muscle in my body locked up. The whisper hadn't been a distant noise, not some trick of the wind or an old house settling. It was right behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my grip, expecting what person? A shadow. But there was nothing, just the open doorway leading back outside, the cold wind rustling through the trees. My stomach turned, my brain scrambling for an explanation. I was alone, and then the door slammed shut. The force of it rattled the walls, sent dust raining from the ceiling. I lunged for the handle, gripping it with both hands, twisting locked. My pulse skyrocketed. No, 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 no. I yanked harder, but it didn't budge. My flashlight flickered, and for half a second, the room was plunged into darkness. And that's when I heard it again. Not a whisper this time. Breathing, slow, wet, ragged, coming from the far corner of the room. I didn't want to look. Every nerve in my body screamed, "Don't turn around." But I couldn't stop myself. I had to see. The flashlight sputtered, the beam weak and trembling as I lifted it toward the corner. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, some trick of the failing light. But then it moved. A shape, too tall, too thin, arms too long, fingers nearly scraping the floor. The skin, if it was even skin, was stretched too tight, like something wearing a human shape but not quite understanding how. And its head tilted, twitching, as if it was just realizing I was there. I took a step back. My heel hit the door. The breathing got louder, shallow, hungry, and then it rushed me. I didn't even have time to scream. It moved too fast. 1 second, it was in the corner. The next, it was inches from my face. The flashlight cut out completely, plunging me into suffocating darkness. I felt it before I saw it. Cold fingers grazing my arm. Not grabbing, not striking, just feeling like it was trying to understand me. My body finally reacted. I kicked, lashed out blindly, my foot connecting with something solid, but wrong. It wasn't flesh, it wasn't bone, it was hollow. The thing made a noise, not a growl, not a scream, but a sound like air rushing through an empty room. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs, and suddenly, I wasn't in the house anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere impossible. I don't know how to explain what happened next. 1 second, I was in that rotting house, something impossible inches from my face. The next I was somewhere else, not outside, not in another room, but somewhere that felt wrong. There were no walls, no ceiling, just darkness stretching in every direction. The floor beneath me was solid, but felt thin, like if I moved too much, I'd fall through. My breath echoed around me, too loud, like I was in some vast, empty space. And then I saw her, Maura. She was standing a few feet away, barefoot, wearing the same clothes from the last confirmed sighting of her. But her face, God, her face. She looked like she had been screaming for years, but had no voice left. Her mouth opened and closed, silent, her eyes hollow, begging. She reached for me. I couldn't move. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't listen. Maura's hand stretched toward me, fingers trembling. She wasn't attacking me, she was pleading. Her mouth kept opening and closing, forming words I couldn't hear, but I felt them, like a pressure in my skull, like something was trying to push through. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't come from her. The breathing, it was still here. Maura's expression twisted in terror. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking past me, at whatever was standing behind me. And then I felt hands on my shoulders. The hands were ice cold, the fingers too long, pressing down like they were testing my weight. Like I wasn't a person, just something to be examined. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to do anything, but I was trapped, frozen in place like a bug pinned under glass. I could still see Maura in front of me, her eyes wide with panic, her lips forming one desperate, soundless word, run. Somehow, my body finally listened. I threw myself forward, breaking free from whatever had been holding me. The floor beneath me cracked like thin ice, and suddenly, I was falling. For a split second, I felt nothing but weightlessness. Then I hit the ground hard. The air punched out of my lungs. My hands scraped against splintered wood. I was back. I was lying on the floor of the house. I gasped, rolling onto my side, my chest heaving. The house was silent. The air was thick with dust, the floor cold beneath me. It was like I had never left, like whatever just happened had been a dream. But then I saw the footprints. Not mine. A trail of wet, bare footprints leading from where I had fallen across the room, toward the door. My stomach twisted. I scrambled to my feet, my legs barely holding me up. The door that had slammed shut before was now wide open. The night outside looked too dark, like the world beyond the doorway wasn't real anymore. And then I heard it, a whisper, right next to my ear. Go! I didn't think. I ran. I don't remember getting to my car. 1 second, I was inside the house. The next, I was behind the wheel. My hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the overgrown driveway. My breath came in ragged gasps, my skin still icy, where those hands had touched me. I slammed the car into reverse, tires skidding over gravel as I sped the hell away from that house. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her, Maura, standing in the middle of the road, watching me go. Her face was blank, her eyes hollow. She didn't move, she didn't follow. She was just there. And then the headlights flickered and she was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. My hands were locked on the wheel, my knuckles white. My brain kept trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was no sense to be made. Maura was there. I saw her. But she wasn't supposed to be. She was supposed to be gone. Vanished without a trace. No one knew where she went, what happened to her. And yet I had been there, wherever there was. For weeks after, I avoided talking about it. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that house. That thing in the dark. Maura's face, her silent plea. And the worst part, I still hear it sometimes. The whisper, right next to my ear. Go! Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.